thought came to me that the reason for your friendship, perhaps its sole reason, and I could never say enough how constant, how disinterested it is what is most particular to me, my privileged part. But how can one become attached to a weary man and only by reason of his weariness? I don't ask that weariness be done away with. I ask to be led back to a region where it might be possible to be weary. And again, is an evocation of the difference between this peculiar sort of affliction and its relation to something that does not concern something outside the interests of life. And then he says, if only weariness could be something, that were something possible. If I could just go to sleep and get over this, some rest, if it was a possible relation in the sense that I would have some relation to it, able to deal with it. But it exceeds his hold by virtue of this exterior relation, or this exterior speech that is coming to me. There is a long exchange then on weariness in the second person singular. So it's not clear who is interrogating whom. But there is a kind of interrogation that the one suffering seems to, the more he suffers, the more he slips from a state of, let's say, a possible weariness or a responsible weariness, tired in relation to some concern, tired in relation to some responsibility. This weariness has a kind of a frivolous character about it. It can't be linked to anything. It can't be assumed. It can't be. You can't take responsibility for it. And so, in that lack of responsibility or that lack of accountability for this weariness, suddenly the law seems to start to appear, or some law which interrogates in sense on what grounds do you claim to be weary? Where are you speaking from? And suddenly it turns into accusation in the third paragraph. As long as you reflect upon what you call your weariness, 1, you show complacency with regard to your weary self. 2, you miss your object, for you encounter no more than the sign of your intention. 3, you attenuate and efface it, drawing meaning and advantage from what is vain. You become interested instead of disinterested. As soon as you start talking about it, you're falsifying what you claim to be doing. And he says, his response is, well, I'm not really talking about it. That's true, but only partially true. I do not reflect, I simulate reflection. This is only a feigned relation. And perhaps this manner of dissimulating belongs to weariness. I do not really speak, I repeat, and weariness is repetition, a wearing away of every beginning. And I not only efface, I increase as well. I exhaust myself in pretending to have still the strength to speak of its absence. All of this is vain, quite true. You work, but what is in vain. I leave you to work then, since it is the only way for you to realize that you are incapable of working. This is a des œuvres for what I'm doing. I'm sorry, John?
Well, why was speech marks called?
Yeah, well, again, it's almost as though he's too weary to bring in the speech marks. It's if it's an internal dialogue or some sort of voice coming from within, he's too weary to assign the position. Next bit. Do you really believe you can approach the neutral through weariness, and through the neutral of weariness better hear what occurs when to speak is not to see? I do not believe it, in fact. I do not affirm it either. Again, the quotation marks are gone. I'm too weary for that. Only someone says this close to me. Someone I do not know. I let them talk. It is an inconsequential moment. So again, suddenly another voice. But it's this other voice with which he's in conversation, which is suggesting, as it says, intimating that through this weariness, through this neutral of weariness, he might, again, better hear the neutral, better hear what occurs when to speak is not to see. So there is this other voice coming. And then we start to hear it again, the neutral. How strangely this sounds to me, again, an other speaking. And then he continues again, trying to get to this otherness. The situation is like this. He has lost the power to express himself in a continuous manner as one would properly, either by conforming to the coherence of a logical discourse, through the succession of this intemporal time that belongs to a mind at work, to one seeking identity and unity, or by yielding to the uninterrupted movement of writing, all forms of continuity. He's lost the capacity to engage such a continuous expression. This does not make him happy. Still, in compensation, he believes now and then that he has gained the power to express himself intermittently, and even the power to give expression to intermittence. Nor does this make him happy. Obviously, this is what has been cited in the essay on interruption. It makes him neither happy nor unhappy, but seems to free him from any relation to a subject capable of happiness or liable to unhappiness. Outside of relation of happiness as might be defined in a worldly sense. Kind of liberation, kind of freedom. When he speaks like everyone, or at least so it seems to him. When he writes, he does so by following the paths that he has opened for himself, and without encountering more obstacles than in the past. What has happened then? He asks himself this, and from time to time he hears the reply, something that does not concern him. So he asks himself, and a voice comes, something that does not concern you. Right? So there's a kind of internal alterity now speaking in him, right? According to this suggestion. The non-concerning, not only what does not concern him, but what for itself is of no concern. Something illegitimate insinuates itself that way. As once, in the sadness of a knowing night, he could have evoked the foreign spirit simply by modifying a few terms. Now he is himself evoked by a simple change in the play of words. I think it's an absolutely gorgeous phrase, because you think of the Blanchot talks about when he was in the 30s while he was becoming a writer. Writing was his nighttime activity, and in the day he would be pursuing a different kind of writing. And I think all of us have at some point or another passed through a time when we were writing in the night or creating in the night in some form. At least I know that very well. And you get the sense of a very peculiar state, of being able to, one is most inspired sometimes in those early hours of the morning, or in moments of stillness and moments in which there's a certain fatigue but still a kind of strange kind of alertness. And he says, he once could have evoked the foreign spirit simply by modifying a few terms and working with language. Now he is himself evoked by a simple change in the play of words. So again, there's another voice speaking, but now it's speaking through the language in its interrupted way of presenting itself to him. And it is presented itself to him in a sentence. To live with something that does not concern him. A sentence. And I think it's a sentence in almost in a juridical sense. He has been sentenced to a relation. And you can't sentence yourself. Right? Or at least not in any normal configuration, rhetorical configuration. So again, another voice is speaking, and he receives this sentence, to live with something that does not concern him. And again, this is an explicit, it appears to be an explicit transcription of that sentence, or that phrase or that word which intervened between the two at the outset, but now has, by virtue of this bringing to language of this other language, has now been transcribed in some form as a sentence that he can now receive. It is a sentence easily received, but in time it weighs upon him. He tries to test it. Is it really life that is involved? And would not with introduce an articulation that precisely here is excluded, and something, neither something nor someone. Finally, this does not concern him, distinguishes him still too much, as though he were appropriating to himself the capacity to be discerned by this very thing that does not concern him. After that, what remains of the sentence? The same, immobile. To live with what does not concern him. Vivre avec cela qui ne concerne pas. There are various ways of responding to this situation. Some say, and I'm very struck by that, some say, who are these others? Suddenly we have a community of those living with this sentence. Some say we must live as though living did not concern us. Others say, since this does not concern us, since this does not concern us, we must live without changing anything about life. But then others, you are changing. You are living non-change as the trace and the mark of that which, not concerning, could not change you. Well, we'd have to, time is moving on, and we'd have to really pause over the modalities of these forms of statement. There are kind of imperatives. One must live as though living did not concern us. Since this does not concern, we must live without. There are like options or obligations, right, that are stable. But then others, you are changing. It's almost, that is part of the sentence as well. You are changing. You are living non-change as the trace and the mark of that which, not concerning, could not change you. You must assume that. Right? So that's a stated condition as opposed to the other which proposes options. What does that mean? You are living non-change as the trace and the mark of that which, not concerning, could not change you. To live non-change is like it's just the most tiniest form of kind of difference from one's way of being. I'm not changing, but I live non-change. So it's the tiniest reflection, the tiniest difference from oneself. Kind of to live en différence, so to speak, right? To live in a difference from oneself, which is not a change in any dimension of life. So it's a question of how one assumes this relation, right? And then we go on, one more paragraph. This is a sentence of a somewhat enigmatic turn. He considers it to be scarcely coherent, uncertain, and of an insistence repugnant to him. It asks neither for acquiescence nor for refutation. Again, it comes as a sentence, but not quite one that one could agree to. It doesn't say, will you live with? It says, to live with what does not concern, without taking him as its object. Nor for refutation. It's not as though it's offered for your choice. It is happened without happening to you. In truth, that is its very mode of persistence, neither affirming nor withdrawing anything, despite the negative turn that puts him into difficulty with himself. All life has changed, life yet intact. He comes to understand that the sentence, which sentence is in question, is there only to provoke intermittence, or through this intermittence to make itself signified, or give this intermittence some content, so that the sentence, is it a sentence? Besides its proper meaning, for it must surely have one, would have as its other meaning this intermittent interruption to which it invites him. So it seems to have a kind of allegorical character, even as it has a character of a statement. Interruption, a pain, a weariness. And while speaking to someone, he comes to feel the cold force of interruption assert itself. Cold force of interruption. Remember the coldness of the madness of the day. And strangely, the dialogue does not stop. On the contrary, it becomes more resolute, more decisive. Yet so hazardous that their relation to the common space disappears between them forever. More resolute, more decisive. Suddenly there is a kind of, a willing resolution, greater engagement of some kind, more decisive, more committed. Right? Suddenly there is a step is made, right, into this other conversation. There is he's impelled to embrace the dialogue. Which dialogue? Well, it seems to be something perhaps. Which dialogue is it? Is it dialogue with the sentence that's come, or is it the dialogue with the others, which we have just read about? And who are these others? Some say we must live as though living did not concern us. Others say, and so forth. What we have of a dialogue seems to be in this other space of those who are suffering the relation to the neutral. Who would those others be? Well, other writers, in some sense, we might guess. Marcus?
Is this an allegorical reading of Levinas? Because Levinas says, we never can know the other. It's impossible. And that the moment that you think you know the other, you're ready to kill him.
Yeah, I mean, I really would not want to say this is an allegory of something, in the sense that there would be some theoretical text, that this text would be staging for us. Right? In a certain sense, he has understood the relation to the other in the Levinasian construction of the relation between self and autrui. He's understood that as a neutral relation. So he's saying the other is present to us in the neutral. But again, the scene that he has constructed between these two individuals, is a scene of dying, whereby the presence of the one is coming to the other in the neutral. So he has, in a certain sense, staged a Levinasian encounter for us in this conversation between these two individuals. But the conversation is moving in the way I've been following. So it's something, it's not an allegory of Levinas. It's an allegory that in some sense entails what he has understood in Levinas and is working through. Although, again, it's an allegory of his own writing at the same time, because it's referring back to his own other instances of writing where there are conversations going on which precede this text in his literary work. So I really would be very uneasy of saying that this is an allegory of some theoretical idea or some supposition. On the contrary, the ideas are sort of coming out of these relations as he's writing them. Though the Levinasian reference is certainly pertinent because of this construction of a relation between two beings who are autrui for each other. But you could also say, isn't this an allegory of his conversations with Blanchot? There's many conversations where this big man is in conversation with him, and and he plays out this unfolding of an exposure to that. Well, you weren't here this morning. I was talking about the exposure of a thought in Blanchot, which is what's another way of talking about this other voice that's starting to appear, this presence of another. So, again, if I just take that phrase, interruption of pain and weariness, while speaking to someone, he comes to feel the cold force of interruption. Interruption comes as a blow and a force. Cold force of interruption asserts itself. Interruption is suddenly s'affirme or asserts itself. There's a presence that's marking itself in some sense. And strangely, the dialogue does not stop. On the contrary, it becomes more resolute, more decisive, yet so hazardous that their relation to the common space disappears between them forever. At the end, when we hear of the decision to will the interruption of discourse, that's a kind of refusal, if we go back to the terms that I was using yesterday in relation to the madness today, a refusal of of discourse in the sense of a gathered, unified space in which we would all belong together. However unhappy we appear to be in any given moment, nevertheless we are together in some common understanding. But this whoever is being referred to here, I guess we can presume, we can work with the idea that this is the host who has come at a certain point in this experience of awareness to actually turn away from any relation to another within that space of discourse or within that space of understanding. So he has, in a sense, refused the other was appealing to him. Look, we're still in the same discourse. I understand you, you understand me, and so forth. At this point, he said no. This is a refusal of that speech of the everyday, which is infinitely precious to hear, infinitely precious to say. He chooses rupture. He chooses the interruption. Again, at the very last sentences, what he had wanted was entirely different. Cold interruption, the rupture of the circle. And at once this had happened, the heart ceases to be dying. So he chooses dying by a kind of refusal of the discourse. But what is that choice? Again, how can we think of that willing? Well, perhaps the willing comes from the dialogue itself, or the conversation itself. While speaking to someone, he comes to feel the cold force of interruption assert itself, and strangely the dialogue does not stop. And he's impelled in that sense into this other space, into this other dialogue. So there is refusal of the common space, but that refusal is at the same time a willing of this other space. And I think in some sense we have to try to understand this passage in those terms. And willing this other space, this is in a certain sense, he wills this force of interruption, and thereby has the power to engage interruption. I mean, it seems to be coming with this cold force of interruption. The fragmentation of the discourse actually gives an impulsion of sorts, or impels him. And so we have this enigmatic way in which if we set up a kind of narrative of the whole thing, there is a debilitating weariness, which is finally brought, its cause, so to speak, it's the event behind it is brought to speech, and as that bringing to speech occurs, another kind of dialogical space opens, and in that dialogical space there's the advent of this other will, which he's attributing to the coming of this other voice. Again, he is now evoked by a change in the words. He is now being impelled by the speaking that's happening in the dialogue. But it's not something of which he has command. Rather, he's been prompted, if you will. He has been prompted into this other speaking. Jonathan, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the last section of the sentence, but I think I understand now. So, in a way, I was thinking originally like it was missing might after space and disappear. Because hazardous suggests danger, which is something might go wrong, if you're not careful. But that's not really what's happening here, because you're saying the common space is definitely gone. So it's almost like it's the lack of the common space that's causing the hazardousness. Or is the hazardousness leading to the possible disappearance of the common space?
But I think the hazardness belongs to this space of exposure. Because there's no safety net here. There's no security. There's no common ground. There's no ground.
Yeah.
It's a radical.
And that's what causes this danger.
Yeah. But he wills it, and that's the curious, turn that's taken. Yeah.
I just had a quick question. Do you notice this weird double plus minus that introduces each section? Is that in the French as well, or is
yes.
that? Okay.
He comments on that at one point. I wish I could remember his words exactly. Or there's a passage where he talks about a double negation and a double affirmation occurring simultaneously. I think that's a plus minus, plus minus. He does this frequently in his fragmented text. He uses little orthographic devices to mark the points of the fragments, and it's very, very crafted, very, very purposeful. And then sometimes it'll disappear, the mark. It's not by chance. It's not a typo. This is all very carefully orchestrated.
Does he have texts which he directly speaks about freedom?
He rarely uses the word freedom. In the text that I read to you, from which I was citing when I talked about that questionnaire, he answered a questionnaire. How do you think about engagement? That's where he talks about freedom. That the only freedom is the freedom of the other. But there is a kind of freeing that goes on here, right? That we are reading. A kind of deliverance in this, but a deliverance to this hazardous space of the fragmentary. I feel a great weariness.
He's implying
as night descends.
He's kind of implying ultimately that this other space, this new space, would be better, or even the common space that's being left behind, although not perhaps immediately.
Truer, in some sense. Truer, but insofar as this is the collapse of the space of truth, it's very hard to speak of the truth, but truer in the sense of being faithful to what's happening between the individuals who undergo this experience in this time of a change, at the end of history, a change of epoch and so forth. So this is an attempt to think the writing of that transition, or that passage beyond the end of the book, the end of the discourse, the end of that common language, or that effort or language that would become common by virtue of its totalizing character. So it's the writing after the closure of the library, so to speak, or after the end of history.
I can't help but hear a little bit of Zizek's reading of Buddhism. I mean, I think it's at this point for me more a feeling than anything direct, I could say, but there was a lot of discussion about sort of willing, non-willing, and this sort of immanent transcendence in a certain sense, and this kind of this sort of falling apart that maybe creates this, especially this discussion of this other space, that in a way is this better, more, something to aim for, but then something that is almost more hazardous and worse in one sense. Actually,
Certainly that would seem very consonant. When I heard he was talking about Buddhism, I thought, wow, is that what I think? So, yes, I would suspect that there is something like that. I was trying to, I think I mentioned that I started this work of Blanchot by trying to come to grips with Levinas's reference to what he called a sabbatical existence. And if you have experienced the Shabbat in a Jewish context, you know that, well, there's a suspension of work, a suspension of labor, and there is the acceptance, or the kind of acquiescence to a peace that's given, and that's the divine Shekinah in the language of this sabbatical event whereby we are invited. It's kind of marriage. We welcome the Shabbat as a bride, and I've been trying to. I haven't been able to address this sufficiently, so to speak, head on. How do we think that curious peace that occurs when one gives oneself over in that time, to not working, to letting oneself simply be there and relax or enjoy, and there's even an injunction, yes, by all means, go to bed with your wife. I mean, it's a relation of it's a non-productive existence, and so it's getting outside. I was trying to, last week, in relation to the Heidegger, I was trying to say he's trying to overcome the metaphysics of productivity and production. So this is a suspension of work, a suspension of the relation of production, and it has a very peculiar temporality. It's a very peculiar space, the Shabbat. And in a sense, what I've been trying to understand when he says "Ce jour s'effaçant, je m'effacerai avec lui," this effacement is a movement into the space, and it is a kind of transcendence. But it's a transcendence. It's a willed transcendence. One wills not to will, in a way, or in the sense of production. It's a movement beyond the will in the sense of subjectivity, in that the subject wills to give itself over to this gift. And I was trying to understand how one could bring that sort of releasement, this is Gelassenheit, this kind of releasement into our existence in some way. And I was very informed. I wrote about this before I started working in Blanchot. I wrote about this in a little book called The Claim of Language, and I cited a very famous Jewish tale, which I can never think about enough. It's a story about several rabbis sitting together, including the main protagonist of this Rabbi Shimon, and they're sitting together and they're discussing the outrageous requirements of the Romans, and what they're doing to Israel, to the nation, and the corruption that they're bringing, and so forth. And one of them says, yes, but they're improving the roads, life is better, and the other is saying, no, but they're corrupting our way of being. But one of them, it turns out, is a spy, as they learn. So Rabbi Shimon takes refuge, and he ends up in a cave where he is hiding for 10 years. And a messenger comes to let him know that there's a kind of that he's being told, well, he can come out now. And he comes out of the cave, and he looks about himself, and he sees that life is going on in the same corrupt way as before, same kind of inauthentic existence. So somehow it has not become, truly a sober and serious piety. And so he burns everything with his eyes, and it's kind of a holocaust in the moment. it burns everything. And suddenly a voice comes from heaven and says, "Will you destroy my world? Get back in the cave." And so he goes back in the cave. And the story says, well, hell lasts only a year. So he comes out after a year. And he's with his son, it turns out. And the son, and he emerges into the day, and the son sees the same thing they saw the last time, and starts, is about to have the same reaction, but when suddenly they see a man with sprigs of myrtle in his hand, as symbolizing the Shabbat. And at that moment, in recognition of the divine mitzvot, this gift of the Shabbat, Rabbi Shimeon gives over. And it no longer demands authenticity, but in some sense accepts the world. And in that gesture, we presume he's still going to be Rabbi Shimeon, and he's going to be out there fighting the Romans and so on and so forth. But he does it from some mysterious acquiescence of accepting the world, saying yes to the world. And that's what I've been trying to get to via Blanchot and via this. Can we envision something like that double yes that we looked at in the Madness of the Day, which is the yes of this ecstatic movement, which would be the yes of the sabbatical existence, but at the same time it's the yes of those beautiful creatures who do not say no to the noise of life, to mentality, to disruption, and do not say no to death. In a certain sense, a double yes which accepts the world. But that's not to necessarily to fall into a passive relation to existence. I mean, on the contrary, this doesn't seem passive. It's more resolute, more decided, more engaged. But how do we then think that engagement? And that was the question I was asking 2 nights ago. How do we think this? How can we think an engagement in the world which nevertheless proceeds from this peaceful acquiescence to the world? Yes to the world. I felt this came from some meditation on the person I thought was most politically engaged as a deconstructive thinker, and that was Gérard Granel, who was really quite frustrated with Derrida, and that he felt Derrida didn't politicize sufficiently his thinking. And Granel was very much on the extreme gauche, a very, very leftist, very Marxist thinker. And he wrote a text which for me was just absolutely hit me like a rocket. It was called A Call to All Those Concerned with the University in View of Preparing Another. And I alluded to this, I think, maybe the other night. But it's an extraordinarily playful repetition of Heidegger, in which he basically got out saying, Heidegger was right. We need to transform the university and to bring it into a better alignment with the concrete existence of those subjects who are working in it. So to destroy the various forms of idealism, the various mystifications, reifications, the various compromises of the university in its bureaucratic scientific structure, to think the university from the question of existence as Heidegger presented it, and in that sense to give it a new concreteness, to give it a reality for our time. I thought, yes, this is it, and I was really very excited about the way Granel was articulating this, a radical critique of the university structures along deconstructed lines. So I thought about this.
Sorry, when was that written? Roughly?
19... around like 78 or something.
Can you repeat the title of the...
It's Gérard Granel. I don't like to cite myself too much, but if you look at my book, The Claim of Language, you'll see a reading of this text and all the bibliographical information you need. Part of the problem is that Granel published this in his own press, and it's not easy to find copies of this. Anyway, as I worked with this, and I really pushed it very hard, I wrote an initial essay, which Granel was really liked, and the way he rewarded me for this was saying, "You are the perfect person to translate my next essay. I need it done in the next 3 weeks." I was given this translation job, and I met him, and I realized, well, I don't think the two of us are going to get along all that well, so that was that in terms of a personal relation. But I was really very, very moved by this, and then I came to feel that nevertheless there was something terribly wrong here, that in this stance, there was at work, and I'll just shortcut to my conclusion, there was at work a kind of global negation of what was. And there was something very metaphysical about this negation of the totality of the structures in which we were working, as though one could draw all of our experience in the university or anywhere else into a single construct, as though the institution could be seen as a totality, when I don't think that's the case with any institution, in fact, or almost any institution, certainly not the academic institution, where there are all kinds of relations going on. And so I came to suspect that, in fact, this stance of negation was a totalizing stance, and was, in some sense, losing a relation to being that I wanted to preserve in some way. And that's what led me then to this, to try to think about, could we think about political action without proceeding from this stance of negation, from this stance of, well, it's not a refusal in the Blanchotian sense, but really a negation of totality. And so I don't, I was saying when you asked your question and I gave it that, I don't have this worked out. But what I'm trying to entertain is this possibility of proceeding politically, but from an extra political relation, which is this double yes.
Do you think this Granel textbook is still relevant in the university today?
Yeah, I mean, Zizek said that to me the other day. He says, I think Heidegger was right.
Zizek said, I think Heidegger was right?
Yes, about the rectoral address.
What?
In the sense that Granel would say that Heidegger was right. That there needs to be a complete, what's the word I'm looking for? A taking apart of the bureaucratic structures of the university in order to free up a relation to human existence in those relations that the university pretends to be dealing with, be it in history, literature, or science, whatever. That we need to bring these forms of these discursive forms into a more concrete form, which is commensurate with, which honors the activity of the subjects who are within it. Again, speaking in a Marxist way, he's trying to sort of proletarianize the university and to make it a site of a more concrete form of relationality. So and Zizek said to me, I think Heidegger was right, in trying to break down the university in order to release, to honor existence in science in a more concrete manner. But as I said, I think that requires, for me, that negation that Granel brought in, as in the language of the extreme gauche, really. Well, I thought it was destructive in a certain sense, in that it's like the voice to Shimon, would you destroy my world? Where do you think you stand? And so it's an effort to rethink the stance, an effort to rethink the relation by which one could then find a more just existence in the world. Yeah.
Do you think this new neutral space that is created by Blanchot, or proposed by Blanchot, is in any way necessitated by the existing order, or is it?
No, it's in some sense that the existing order is that despite everything, there are still traces of something that exceeds the let's say the order of technique or bureaucracy, however you want to talk about this.
But there is a condition of this emergence of new space.
Yeah, the condition is something like strange weirdness, or the sense that even if we complete the project of the totality of what is, even if we bring about a total subsumption of our existence in meaning, something will be missing. And so when we try to save at the end, something will be not quite there. And so there's this trace of an insufficiency, of a failing, of a wanting, of that there must be something more.
So in other words of putting it, is Blanchot, is what Blanchot's doing is to affirm these possibilities in the existing order.
Well, Blanchot is, again, Blanchot is, he's pretty, this is where we have to start thinking about refusal. Is refusal like that global negation that I was describing to Ghana? I don't think so. I think that refusal has a much more complex structure. But this is perhaps not so far from what Ghana was saying. So, and I don't want to refuse refusal in that sense. I think you do, in a certain sense, you have to say, you have to delimit from dimensions of this order. But that's not the same thing as saying that we need a tabula rasa in order to proceed. Yeah, it's 7 o'clock. Go ahead.
Okay, it's really quick. It's more of a comment than a question, but when we got to towards the end, when he gets confronted by the wariness, and it seems to me that it's almost like a Schopenhauerian will being flowing through him, because he doesn't. The person here, they get into this discussion of all these different people who are also confronted by the same thing. And yet it doesn't seem that he's choosing any of it. It's really chosen for him, that it's asserted onto him, and so he doesn't really have he's not active.
It impels him in some way.
Yeah, it motivates him sort of like.
But there is a choice at the end, how he come to will the interruption of discourse. And it's as though he would not have willed the interruption of discourse had he not already been impelled by this other voice or this other relation. So it's not that he leaves the discourse and then finds the other relation. It's rather the discourse is fragmenting, and in that fragmentation there is this cold force of interruption, which then carries him.
Which is sort of similar to Schopenhauer's will. And somewhat.
Perhaps, but it's a will,
right?
And there's a whole a whole metaphysical idea of a subject behind that will. But yeah, there's another will. And Heidegger starts talking about the truth willing itself. And so there are other ways of talking about it. But I think this is very much a displacement of a subjectivity, or a subject that in willing would bring about a unified totality, or might be lying at the ground. There's no ground for this will. It's precisely the lack of ground from which this impulsion comes, from fragmentation. But what's lying in that fragmentation is still elaborate.